This dog astonished everyone by stopping the removal of his owner from life support. The heartfelt reason behind it will bring tears to your eyes. They say that dogs are man's best friends, and Steven's story proves just how true that is. Throughout his career as a police officer in the canine unit, Steven was responsible for training and handling police dogs. Among the many canine partners he had, a German Shepherd named Duke stood out, forming an exceptional bond with him. When Steven's retirement approached, Duke was only a year old. The thought of leaving without Duke was unbearable for Steven, so he asked his boss if he could take the dog with him, considering Duke as part of his family. Fortunately, his boss agreed, allowing Steven to bring Duke into his retirement. Despite his strong name, Duke was a gentle and meek puppy, preferring cuddles over play fighting and cherishing every moment spent with Steven. At first, Steven's wife and children were a bit wary of allowing the dog into their home, as he had been trained as a police dog and knew how to attack if necessary. But Steven reassured them, telling them that he had trained the canine himself and that the dog would not harm anyone. As Duke settled into his new home, the family quickly got used to him, and he soon became another loved member of the household. But then something happened that made Duke change his behavior completely. It was a couple of years after the canine was first brought home. He was roughly 3 years old and a fully mature adult dog at this time. The day started like any other normal day. Duke and Steven went on their morning run and then came back to have their breakfast. As they approached the house, Steven noticed that the roof needed some work as it looked worn down. After breakfast, Steven collected the tools he needed to fix it and began to climb up onto the roof of the house. At this point, Duke started to act strangely. The dog began to bark and whine and even tried to hold on to Steven's trouser leg to keep him on the ground. Getting fed up, Steven called his wife and asked her to put the canine in the house as he wasn't letting him work. Steven's wife did as asked and took the dog inside. However, he resisted all the way to the house. Not even 5 minutes later, the family heard a terrible scream coming from the front garden. They quickly rushed out of the house, all except Duke, who was locked in the kitchen. What they found outside shocked them all. There, lying on the grass in front of the garden, was Steven. He had fallen off the roof and hit his head on the ground. Steven's wife began to cry and called out to him. However, he did not react. While she was doing this, their children called emergency services for an ambulance. A short while later, Steven was rushed to the hospital, where he was placed in critical care and given extensive scans to determine the extent of his injuries. While the doctors found a few scrapes and bruises, including a broken arm, they were most worried about Steven's head injury. His wife told them that he had hit his head on the ground quite hard, and they worried this could have caused irreparable damage. Their fears were soon realized. Steven slipped into a coma, and nothing seemed to help wake him up. After Steven had been in the hospital for a while, his family decided to take him home and hire a nurse to check up on him, as they felt a familiar environment might help the man wake up again. Once Steven was back home, the first one by his side was Duke. The dog had been crying for days, sad that his owner was nowhere to be found. The canine quickly made his home at the end of Steven's bed and rarely left the area unless it was to be fed or to relieve himself outside. 2 years passed, and there was still no sign that Steven was ever going to wake up. The cost of keeping him on the incubator and having a nurse look after him soon began to add up, and his family began to despair over what they should do. The only one who stuck by the man's side the entire time was Duke. One day, a doctor went to check on Steven when he noticed something about the man. After a few more checks, the doctor realized that even though he couldn't move or speak, Steven could still feel what was happening around him. It was at this point that the doctors told the family that it might be best if Steven was humanely euthanized to put an end not only to his suffering, but to the family's as well. Steven's wife was devastated by this news and didn't know what to do. Steven was the love of her life, and she had planned on spending the rest of their days together. Sadly, she accepted the idea that it might be better for him if he was allowed to rest and agreed with the doctor's suggestion of euthanasia. The only problem was that Steven would have to be taken to the hospital for the process to be done. The doctor reassured Steven's wife and told her that he would send a team around the next day to take Steven to the hospital. While this was happening, Duke sat in the corner and seemingly watched and listened to everything being said. The next day, when the paramedics arrived to collect Steven, something strange happened. As the paramedics began to enter Steven's room, Duke began to bark and growl at them in an angry manner. He bared his teeth and clearly threatened to bite them if they tried to come any closer to the man. Terrified of the canine, the paramedics refused to enter the room until the dog was out of the way. Stephen's daughter entered the room and forcefully removed Duke, taking him outside so that he couldn't harm anyone. Once the dog was out of the way, the paramedics quickly got Stephen into the ambulance and drove off to the hospital. As he saw the vehicle drive off, Duke began to pull on his leash. He pulled so hard that the daughter felt she had no choice but to unleash him. Once free, the dog began sprinting down the street after the ambulance. Seeing the canine so worked up, Stephen's wife began to wonder if the animal was trying to tell her something. The animal had gotten very upset before Stephen had fallen from the roof, and he was acting in the exact same way now. Worried that she might have made a terrible mistake, she got into her car and drove after the dog. Once she reached the hospital, she noticed Duke running into the building. The dog quickly followed his nose and found the room where Stephen was. The canine then charged into the hospital room only to see a doctor about to inject his owner with the euthanizing drug. The dog quickly pounced on the doctor, pushing him to the floor and causing him to drop the drug. The doctor cried out in terror and began to scream for someone to help get rid of the dog. Just as someone was about to try and remove the canine, they all heard a sound that made them freeze. Stephen's heart monitor began to pick up speed. Then they heard a quiet and raspy voice call out for them to leave the dog alone. With everyone too shocked to move, Duke moved away from the doctor and over to Stephen's bedside, his tail wagging the whole time. Stephen's wife entered the room only to realize that her husband had finally woken up. She was overcome with joy and began to cry. It was a miracle. He was back. Once the initial shock wore off, the doctor quickly got to his feet and began to examine Stephen to ensure he was truly okay. Meanwhile, Stephen's wife called their children to share the wonderful news. After a few weeks, Stephen was finally released from the hospital and able to go home. Upon his arrival, Duke was the first to greet him, jumping up and showering him with kisses. Stephen chuckled and knelt down to the floor, giving Duke a huge hug and lots of affection. He knew that if it weren't for his loyal canine companion, he wouldn't be here today. What do you think of this stir? Let us know in the comment section. I hope you liked this video. Please give it a thumbs up and share it with your loved ones. Also subscribe and press the bell icon to never miss the update from our channel. Thank you.